Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright, so this episode will be about mana doublers. This is part 5 of the series, and this is one that I very much look forward to. So, in general deck building, most people would suggest having, so many lands. I generally just use 35 as a default, but I think the standard is either 37 or 38. Then there's like 10 card draw spells, 10 mana ramp spells, and then the rest you can do whatever. Usually there's a certain amount of removal or board wipes you might want to do. That's up to you. But the 10 card draw and the 10 mana ramp are kind of essential. You don't want to leave those out of any deck. So the previous video series about card draw went over things to help you with card draw in green. This whole series is all about mana ramp in green. But doublers are where I kind of make a separate category. In most of my decks, I would have 10 sources of mana ramp. Mostly, in about 2/3 of them, that's going to be the things that get lands from video 1, the Cultivates, Gedama, Reaches, things like that. Then on top of that, I would include 5 mana doublers. So, yeah, I am a big advocate of not only having extra ramp, but not even counting the doublers towards that initial mana ramp, so that you not only do you ramp more, but also because if you've got the mana doublers out, but you're not getting extra lands into play, they're not going to be as effective. If you're getting extra lands into play, so you have 12, 13 lands in play and a doubler, that's huge. If you're only playing 1 land per turn and then you have a doubler out, 4 lands in play and a doubler on turn 5, you've ramped, but it's not anything huge or crazy. So you're not going to be nearly as effective. So these cards I would suggest playing in conjunction with having the ability to get a lot of extra lands in play. So I would consider them almost like a separate category of this is in addition to the rest of the ramp. Now we're going to start with what I consider to be the top of the line, top tier cards of this category. And we'll get right into it with Zendikar Resurgent. This is 7 mana, including double green. It's an enchantment. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. And whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. This one does the 2 things that you really care about doing, and is just amazing card. It's one of the best cards in green. You already know it is because it shows up in so many decks. But the fact that it fits into 2 different categories, I like to abuse that to either include it in the mana doubler category, of which I want 5 in a deck, and then I have effectively 11 card draw spells because I'll have 10 card draw spells, and then Zendikar Resurgent isn't even in that category. Or I'll put it in the card draw category, and then I'll basically have 6 mana doublers. So I've ramped extra hard and got more ability to draw into mana doublers. Vernal Bloom only costs 4 mana, including a single green. Also an enchantment. Whenever a forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds green to his mana pool. So this one is a symmetrical effect. It'll help your opponents just as much as you. It applies to any forest, so it'll apply to any dual lands or the tri-lands that have forest in their typing. But it doesn't apply to any land the way that Zendikar Resurgent does. So if your opponents aren't playing green, this won't really help them at all. If your opponents are playing green, but they're playing like 3 or 4 colors, then they won't get nearly the benefit that you would. The one thing that's kind of interesting, though, is it doesn't matter what the forest taps for. So if it's a dual land and it taps for the other color, you'll get the green from this. Or if, Contamination, that stupid black card that says all lands produce black instead of their normal color. If an opponent's playing that card, you have Vernal Bloom out, you tap your forest for a black because you have to, and then this will add a green as well. So it can help you get out of that lock a little bit there too. I've run into that once, so I remember it being an issue. Other than that, it's a great card, and this is in the same category as Zendikar Resurgent. One of the best cards you could be playing in green, is especially because it costs less mana. You can get it out so much earlier. It's a phenomenal card. Mana Reflection is another great one. This one costs 6 mana, including double green enchantment. If you tap a permanent for mana, it produces twice as much of that mana instead. So this one doesn't just care about lands, it'll apply to your mana rocks and your mana dorks. So if you're playing an elf deck or a mana dork based ramp deck, Mana Reflection will go into that, whereas some of these other ones aren't as good. And it just is a phenomenal card. It's expensive, so I can understand it. It's not going to go in every deck, but if it were cheaper, it should go in every deck, just about. Gauntlet of Power, a 5 mana artifact. When it comes into play, you choose a color. Creatures of the chosen color get +1/+1. And whenever a basic land is tapped for mana of the chosen color, its controller adds 1 mana of that color to his or her mana pool. So another symmetrical effect that will affect your opponents as well, but this one will only affect basic. So if they're playing 3 or 4 colors, they're probably not going to have too many basics of that, whereas they might have more dual lands. It does buff up your creatures, so they do get the Anthem effect, which is just a nice thing to add on to it. The upside to this one, I think, what the benefit that this one has is it, well, it's got a few, but you get to choose what color it is. So if you are playing 2 or 3 colors, then you can pick the one that's more dominant in your deck. If you are playing any other monocolor deck, red, white, black, whatever, it goes in those as well. I will say the downside of this, though, is any artifact creatures you have won't get the benefit. So if you're playing a mono green deck, but you have like a Solemn Simulacrum or something in there, the colorless creature won't get the buff. Only your green creatures will. Caged Sun is 6 mana, and it's also an artifact. When it enters, you choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1, so another Anthem effect. Whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, you add 1 more of that color. So this one doesn't just apply to basic lands, but it does only apply to you. This one does not have the Anthem effect for your opponent's creatures. It does not have the ability for your opponent's lands to tap for extra mana. It only helps you. But it does cost 6 mana, which with these cards, I generally think that the mana cost of them is more important than usual. I'm much more mana sensitive, but these 5 are the absolute top 5 best mana doublers. And if you're playing green, I would suggest running all 5. You'll have the mana to do all kinds of things. Unless you're doing something with like an infinite combo and you don't care about generating tons of mana, you just have like one little mana dork that you can tap or untap infinitely and do something like that, then you don't need these or necessarily care about them. But any other case, these are just so incredibly powerful and will make your deck shoot up in strength. So now that I've kind of individually talked about what each one does, I do want to just do a quick review of how exactly that might affect your ability to generate mana. So right here, I just pulled up a few examples. A basic forest, if you had these 4 things in play, Vernal Bloom, Mana Reflection, Gauntlet of Power, and Caged Sun, a basic forest would produce 5 green mana for you. It would produce 2 on its own because of Mana Reflection. It would tap for 2 because of Mana Reflection. Vernal Bloom would add 1. Gauntlet of Power would add 1. Caged Sun would add 1. You get 5 total mana. Nykthos, if you had a devotion of 5, it would produce 11 total because it would tap for 5, but it would be doubled to 10 thanks to Mana Reflection. And then the Caged Sun would also add 1 mana. Nykthos isn't a forest, so it doesn't get anything from Vernal Bloom, and it's not a basic land, so it doesn't get anything from Gauntlet. Next would be Zagoth Triome. The Triome would give you 4 mana in green. So if you tap it for green, it would tap for 2 thanks to the mana reflection. It is a forest, so it would give you a green from Vernal Bloom, and it is adding green, so you would get a green from Cage Sun. Now, you would, if you tapped it for blue or black, you would get 3, because you would get, if you did blue, you would get 2 blue thanks to mana reflection, and then you would get 1 green thanks to Vernal Bloom. You would not get any benefit from Gauntlet because it's not a basic, and the land is not adding any green mana, so you wouldn't get anything from Cage Sun. If you did Hinterland Harbor, you'd only get 3 green mana. You would get 2 from thanks to tapping it with mana reflection, and then you would add 1 more from Cage Sun. If you tapped it for the blue, you would only get 2 blue thanks to mana reflection, and that's it. Volcanic Island is the same thing as Zagoth Triome, where if you tapped it for green, you would get 2 thanks to mana reflection, then you get 1 extra from Vernal Bloom, and you get 1 extra from Cage Sun. You get 4 total. Simic Growth Chamber is the one that's a little bit different because it adds 2 different colors. So with mana reflection, it would give you double green, double blue, and then the Cage Sun would add 1 more green to it. Also worth pointing out is how these cards would affect your opponents. If your opponent tapped a basic forest, they would get 3. 1 for the forest, 1 from the Vernal Bloom, 1 from Gauntlet of Power. If your opponent tapped Nykthos, they would get whatever. You're not helping them. If they tapped the Zagoth Triome or the Volcanic Island, they would, if they tap it for green, they would get 2 green thanks to Vernal Bloom, but they would not get anything else. If they tapped the Hinterland Harbor, they would get nothing from you, and Simic Growth Chamber, they would get nothing from you. So I did want to kind of go over the slightly different ways that these cards might work in a deck. For me, I'm usually just playing all basics and a Nykthos, so those are the only ones that I actually really care about how they are affected. But I wanted to give you other options in case you're playing more than one color deck or you're playing other non-basics, because there are other non-basic things that are fit in a mono green deck that aren't just forest but do tap for green. So next, you can see some very powerful cards. Now, I made a big point of saying that the previous 5 were the tier 1 best mana doublers, and these ones are tier 2. I just want you to take a moment to absorb that. These are tier 2. Hopefully you're thinking that I'm crazy right now, and you're wondering how I could possibly say that about such powerful cards, but that's what I'm excited to talk about. That's one of the reasons why I've been looking forward to this part of the series, is because the mana doublers are so powerful, so great and awesome, that these are in the second tier of those. And I'll tell you exactly why. Starting with Nyxbloom Ancient, 7 mana, including triple green, 5/5 trampler, elemental, enchantment creature. It's an elemental. If you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead. Incredibly powerful card. When it was spoiled and then released, it gained a lot of popularity, and it was a lot of people were very excited about it. For me, it was just kind of business as usual because I've been using mana doublers for quite some time. So it's another card in a group of a bunch of cards that I already had and played and used multiples of in every deck. The reason why I was less excited about it, and the reason why I think it's overrated, one, I assume it's because people didn't really look at the mana doublers as much and give them the time of day. With the exception of Zendikar Resurgent, the cards see a good amount of play, but they're not like must runs. When you think of staples, the mana doublers aren't up there to the same extent that a lot of other cards are, and they should be because they're amazing. This one kind of brought attention to it, and so people got overly excited. What I don't like about it is that it costs 7 mana, and as I mentioned, I am much more sensitive about mana cost when it comes to mana doublers, and I'll go into that right now. If you're on like turn 4 and you have 4 lands out, you get the Vernal Bloom out. Turn 5, now you got at least 8 mana, 10 if you make a land drop, and you can start going. If you're waiting till you're at that point with 10 mana, maybe you cast a Cage Sun by tapping 3 of your lands, and now your final 2 lands tap for 3 each, and you still have 6 mana left over to do something else. Cast your commander or cast a card draw spell or something. As the mana cost goes up, though, suppose you're on turn like 9 or something and you got 12 lands in play. If you start by tapping, four of them for a Vernal Bloom, then you still have 8 untapped and they tap for 2 each. If you have to tap 7 of them to even get to your mana doubler, then you have fewer untapped lands, which will tap for extra mana, to then start snowballing your turn. So the mana cost on mana doublers is very relevant to me, and so as a 7-drop, that is a big downside. Now, the other thing that I don't like about it is that it's a creature. So if you are playing any kind of tribal deck, if I'm playing an elf tribal deck, if I'm playing anything that this just doesn't fit into, it doesn't fit kind of the requirements of the deck, I can't include it. And I know I'm more like strict as far as putting those deck building restrictions on myself. You might not care as much. You might include this elemental creature in your Hydra deck, your elf deck, your whatever deck, bear deck, but I won't. So I don't like that. The other thing is, as a creature, he is far more vulnerable to removal. Now, anyone could do like a mass enchantment board wipe or a mass artifact board wipe, but those are less common. The main way that they would remove something like a Vernal Bloom or Zendikar Resurgent is probably going to be a targeted removal. They still have those in there. Your opponents are still going to have them. But in order for them to get rid of it, they have to 1-for-1. So if you have 2 or 3 or 4 of these, then they can't get rid of all of them with a targeted removal. And also, if they're wasting it on that, that's it's bad for you because you're losing the mana doubler, but you're also eliminating a key card out of your opponent's hand, the targeted removal. And that does have a certain value to you that them wasting a murder or a creature-based board wipe just doesn't. You're more likely to be devastated by it, and what it cost your opponent is going to be less. But it is a 5/5 trampler and a creature, which means it will draw you cards off of Zendikar Resurgent or off of Guardian Project or whatever. And it does have plenty of upsides. It's a phenomenal card. I do think it's overrated because I would rather have the other ones. Nissa, Who Shakes the World, 5 mana, including double green. Legendary Planeswalker, Nissa, starts with 5 loyalty. Whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. She's got a +1 where you can basically turn a land into a creature and untap it, or you can just plus her and you don't even have to turn a land into a creature. You could just plus her and not do that, but if you're looking to get extra mana, you might want to actually untap the land just to ramp yourself a little bit if you need a little bit of extra mana. I would generally try to avoid it if I don't need the mana, just because your land is now a creature, is now more vulnerable, and you're vulnerable to lose it. The Ultimate's fantastic. It gets you every forest out of your library, and also if you happen to have already animated some forest into creatures, then you can, now they're indestructible, and later on in the game, if you ult and still have her around, you can start uptaking her just freely without any real consequence to it. One thing that I dislike about Nissa is that if you get her out super early, like turn 4, maybe you turn 3 cultivate, and then turn 4 you have 5 lands in play, and you play her. If any of your opponents have any, I mean, you probably don't have creatures unless you played it on turn 1 or 2, and if your opponents have any flyers, she's super vulnerable, and you might just lose her right away, just to an attack, because planeswalkers can be attacked directly. If you get her out kind of towards the middle of the game, then she's a little bit more fine. You might have more blockers. You may not necessarily have things with reach, but you're a little bit safer. And there's probably other targets that your opponents might care about more. Or as opposed to if you get her out on turn 4, she's almost certainly the prime target. The thing that is really great about her is if you happen to be playing a deck with Doubling Season, she comes out with 10 loyalty, you ult her right away, you get all the forest out, they also tap for 2, and from that point on, if she survives, you can just uptick her and start making the creatures. 6/6 creatures, because of Doubling Season. Next, Extraplanar Lens, 3 mana artifact. It has imprint. When it comes into play, you may remove exile target land you control from the game. Whenever a land with the same name as the imprinted card is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana to his or her mana pool of any type that land produced. So, I've played this card on turn 3, exiled one of my lands, then someone blows up the Extraplanar Lens, now I'm down a land, and I don't have a doubler. Even if that doesn't happen, you would have 2 lands. I mean, going into turn 4, assuming you make a land drop, you now have 3 lands that tap for 2. You're still... It almost feels like you've been board wiped and you're rebuilding, which is weird to say for a mana doubler. It just has that weird effect because you've gone down a land. Now, if you're somewhere in the middle of the game where you have like 15 lands in play, you top deck, you play a big card draw spell, you draw like 9 cards, this is one of them, you tap, a few of your lands, play this out, then you have, still 6, 7, 8 lands untapped. It's great. As a 3 mana doubler, it's something that's just amazing to get out kind of in the middle of the game after a big card draw spell. And it's good to have in your opening hand if you can get it out on turn 3, assuming that it sticks around and survives and you keep ramping afterwards. Because as soon as this thing's out on like turn 3, you got to feel nervous about it sticking around, and so you very much want to start getting more lands out. Cultivates, Kodama's Reaches, Explosive Vegetations. You want to rebuild the number of lands you have just in case this gets destroyed. You're going to be back on track just in the quantity of lands. One thing that I hate about this card, though, is the trick with snow-covered lands. Because it'll add mana, it'll make any land with the same name that's been imprinted tap for an extra mana. Everyone goes for the snow-covered land trick, where they play all snow-covered lands, and then they exile one of those, and then only snow-covered basics of whatever type will tap for mana, so your opponents are less likely to benefit off the symmetrical effect. Personally, I mean, I'll just let if my opponents are also at basic forest, they can get the extra mana. I don't care. To me, that trick, not only is it petty, and strategically it makes sense. If you have a card that gives a symmetrical effect, you only want to play it if you're going to get the most benefit out of it. If you're playing an artifact deck and the artifact is Blinkmoth Urn, you get extra mana during your upkeep during your first main based on the number of artifacts. If you're playing an artifact deck, you're fine with the symmetrical effect. If you're not, stay away from it. If you're playing a deck with a ton of forest, Vernal Bloom is a fine symmetrical effect. If not, probably not a great card for you. And this one, because you have the ability to have a little bit of control over it, you can limit the benefit that your opponents get if they aren't playing snow-covered lands. Strategically, it makes sense. I get that, but it just feels like such a jerk move. It's the person. It's the Poindexter who's just trying to praise himself, telling himself how smart he is. Look at me, I'm such a genius. I'm so tricky and awesome. look at how smart I am pulling off this thing. Oh, I bet you thought you were going to benefit off of it too. Nuh-uh, nuh-uh. I found the nerd loophole. I hate that aspect to it. It brings out the absolute most the worst qualities in a person. It just makes you sound so just full of yourself when you think you're smart for pulling off that trick. I hate that about it. So moving on. It's one of the saltiest cards in all of Commander, Vorinclex, Voice of Hunter. 8 mana, including double green, 7/6, legendary Praetor. He has trample. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. Also, whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, that land doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Now, I am one of the 106 people that have a Vorinclex deck. And there's a lot I can say about this creature. I don't believe he deserves his place as one of the saltiest creatures or saltiest cards in all of Commander. And that's an argument for another time, but I think that people whine and moan about him way more than is justifiable. But which is why I personally only play him in 2 decks. The one where he's a commander, and another one, Reki, which cares about legendary things. He is a legendary creature, so he goes in the Reki deck, which cares about legendary things. I have 2 other decks that want a lot of mana, and include, one of them has 10 mana doublers, the other one has 13, or 14 or something, and would love the addition of Vorinclex, just because he's a mana doubler. I don't even care about the shutdown effect to him, but I choose to not include him in either of those or any other deck that he would fit appropriately in, just because I know how salty he is, and I'm a big advocate for, in Commander, there's the Commander code, you gotta not be the biggest jerk at the table. So I do think that he's far overrated for as a saltiness, as a salty card. But he is a great card, a great creature, and if you are looking to include him, I definitely think that there's a great reason for wanting to, but do try to restrict yourself in other ways. You know, everyone should have some limitation on what they're willing to do, and you need to show restraint in one way or another. For me, I choose to Vorinclex is one of the things that I choose to limit my use of, and for you, maybe you want to use him but limit other things. He is a great mana doubler though. And then the last one in this category is Leyline of Abundance, 4 mana including double green. It's an enchantment. If that is in your opening hand, you may begin with it on the battlefield. Whenever you tap a creature for mana, add an additional green. And then you can pay 8 mana, including double green, to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. So this one is unique to all of the other ones I've mentioned so far, because this one applies to your creatures, your mana dorks. This one does not add extra. This one doesn't care about your lands. So if you're playing a mana dork deck, a bunch of elves, a bunch of druids, things that already tap for mana, this one is great because it will add an extra 1 to that. If you're playing even if you're playing a deck with a bunch of 1/1 counters, this can be good just for the 1/1 counter side of it, although it is expensive at 8 mana. If you've got 50 tokens on board, 8 mana to put a 1/1 counter on all of them, very good value there, especially if you're playing stuff like Doubling Season. It's very valuable in certain decks like that. But if you're just playing a bunch of mana dorks, then it's also highly valuable in like an Elf Ball deck. Next, because of the way that one's worded and a couple of the other ones, I do want to go over real quick exactly how things work with Leyline of Abundance, Mana Reflection, and Nyxbloom Ancient in particular. Because all of these require you to tap a permanent, in the case of Leyline, a creature, for mana. Now, one thing that I think some people might get a little bit confused about, which is why I want to take the time to point it out, is certain things don't tap for mana, even though you tap them and they add mana. Burstlore Rangers, Seton Crozen Protector, and Heritage Druid. Those things don't tap for mana. And what that means is, we'll use Seton as the example. If you have Seton out, you tap a Druid, including himself, add a mana. So suppose you had Seton on the battlefield and you had a Llanowar Elves. If the Llanowar Elves just came into play, so it has Summoning Sickness, you can use Seton's ability to tap a Druid, which would be the Llanowar Elves. Tap the Llanowar Elves, you add a green mana. You didn't tap the Llanowar Elves for mana. On the other hand, if the Llanowar Elves has already been out, you can just use the Llanowar's natural ability to tap for a green, and then that would be eligible for adding an extra mana for Leyline or being doubled to Mana Reflection or Nyxbloom Ancient. So the difference is Seton, Burstlore, Heritage Druid, those all have the ability where you tap a creature, either a different creature or itself. They all do apply to themselves. So you tap a creature, add a mana. Now let's look at other things like Centennial, Hierophants, Cryptolith Rite, and Song of Freyalise. These all have the very specific text of, quote, of creatures gain, quote, tap, add mana. In the case of Sentinel, it's green, Cryptolith, it's any color, and Song of Freyalise, it's any color. But those give the creature the ability, quote, tap, add mana, which would combine with Leyline, Mana Reflection, and Nyxbloom Ancient. So hopefully that's a little bit more clear. If you are playing a Seton deck and you have Leyline or Mana Reflection, then they do go in that deck, and I do have both of those cards in my Seton deck. However, you got to know that any of your druids that don't naturally tap for mana won't get that benefit, or any, such as Seton himself, does not naturally have tap, add mana, and any creatures that have Summoning Sickness, such as Llanowar Elves. They will tap with Seton's ability, but they will not get the benefits from Leyline or Mana Reflection until they've been on the board and they don't have Summoning Sickness. Then they'll benefit from those other effects. So hopefully that's a little bit more clear, and you can avoid accidentally cheating. You can avoid your opponents, other people, accidentally cheating. Sometimes you might do this and it's beneficial, or maybe it ends up screwing you over in a bad way. But either way, you can avoid playing mistakes by knowing the difference. So that leads us into our third tier of mana doublers. These are the varying degrees of okay, but they are definitely in the bottom tier of mana doublers. Dictate of Karametra costs 5, including double green. It's an enchantment with flash. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana to his or her mana pool of any type that land produced. So another symmetrical effect, but it affects everything that your opponents might have. Whether it's basic, whether it's green, whether it's anything, it helps everything. I don't like that. The best way you could use this card is with flash. You save up 5 mana, then you use it on the end step before your turn, and then you at least benefit from it first, as opposed to just playing it like on turn 5 and benefiting, giving everybody else the benefit before you. Generally speaking, though, aside from early, the very early turns when you just have enough mana to play the doubler, once you're at a certain point in the middle of the game where you've got a bunch of lands in play and you have access to like 20 mana or something, I want to cast the mana doublers as early as possible at the beginning of my turn, so that all remaining untapped lands will produce that extra mana for the rest of my turn. So as a 5 mana doubler, it's not a bad price. It's at a good CMC. The downside to it's pretty huge, and I just generally don't like it unless you're trying to stuff as many mana doublers into your deck as possible, or you're trying to be very budget. I can understand that too. It would also go in group hug decks. Otherwise, it's in the third tier for a reason. Next is Heartbeat of Spring. This one costs 3 mana, including a single green. It's an enchantment. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana of that type to his or her mana pool. So this one doesn't have flash, but it only costs 3. So this one I think is probably even better, because if you are playing it at the beginning of a turn in which you have a ton of mana already, it only costs 3, so you only have to tap 2 or 3 lands to get it out and buff up all of your lands for the rest of the turn. If you get it out on turn 3, then yeah, you're helping your opponent. Your opponents will get the benefit of it first, but you'll start turn 4 will hopefully be really good for you. I still don't like it because of the symmetrical effect and the non-restricted symmetrical effect. It helps all of your opponent's lands, no matter what kind it is. I don't like that, but if you're going for every mana doubler, or it's not super cheap, but it is cheaper than a lot of the better ones, you could consider including it. I'm just not very high on it. Keeper of Progenitus. It's a 4 mana, including a single green, 1/3 elf druid. This one says whenever a player taps a mountain, forest, or plains for mana, that player adds 1 mana to their mana pool of any type that land produced. So this is a mana doubler that, it's got a few oddities to it. One, it's an elf druid, so you might be tempted to play it in an elf deck. However, I would advise not doing that, because if you're in that kind of deck anyway, you might as well use elves for your mana ramp, use your mana dorks that way. And if you're ramping that way, you don't also need to ramp from the lands, because if you did that, thinking that you were just giving yourself extra ramp, well, think about the symmetrical effect. If you have 5 lands in play on turn 5, and also a few mana dorks that'll produce 5 more mana, you will now, thanks to this, get 15 mana from 10. The 10 would be 5 from mana dorks, 5 from lands. The 15 would be 5 from mana dorks, 10 from lands. Your opponents, meanwhile, will go from 5 mana from lands to 10 mana from lands, plus whatever rocks they might have. So you've gone up 50% from 10 to 15. Your opponents have gone up 100% from 5 to 10. The symmetrical effect is benefiting your opponents more than it is you. You might as well stick to mana dorks. So it does not fit in an elf deck if you're playing mana dorks or anything else. It just doesn't, because the symmetrical effect has greater potential to help your opponents more than it does you. It is restricted to mountains, forests, and plains, so it will affect only those lands, be it basic or dual lands or whatever. If your opponent's playing mono black or blue or Dimir, then it won't help them at all. If they're playing like 4 or 5 colors, they're doing a bunch of non-basics that don't have basic land types, then they won't get the benefit off of it. So there's no guarantee that your opponents will get a whole lot off of it, but they'll generally get something. And just like the previous couple, I don't mind symmetrical effects such as the Vernal Bloom or the Gauntlet of Power. I do mind a symmetrical effect like this one. So if it doesn't go in an elf deck, and it does have the downside of benefiting your opponents, where does it go? I think that it's okay. If you're doing as many doubling effects as possible, which, like I said, I have a couple of decks that just run as many of these as I can, it goes in there just because it's another effect that goes in there. If you're playing just kind of jank, if you just want some low costed creatures that will benefit you, and you're not really otherwise providing a whole lot of ramp, if you're going like creatures only but you don't want mana dorks, maybe there, but it's tough to really justify his position in a lot of decks. Then there's Regal Behemoth. This one is 6 mana, including double green, 5/5 lizard with trample. When he enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. Whenever you tap a land for mana while you're the Monarch, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this one does see a lot of play, and I don't get it. I understand that, well, he's a lizard. He's not even a dinosaur. So maybe he's been errated to dinosaur. That would make a little bit of sense. Where to even begin? I know a lot of people like the Monarch ability. I personally don't, because it can often be hard to keep. And if your opponents have flyers or they have death touchers, then it can be hard to steal it from those same opponents. Or if they have a lot of like propagandas and things that require you to pay to attack them, then it's easier for them to hold on to it. Because even if you have an army of tokens or you have an army of big trample creatures, you know, if your opponent has an unblockable flyer, death toucher, whatever that you just can't deal with, then you don't necessarily have a way to get it back. And if you play this and you don't have any other follow-ups, so you don't get the benefit of the double mana the turn that this comes into play, there's a good chance that you won't be the Monarch when it comes back to you. Now, even if your opponents don't have a great board state and you are able to regain the Monarch, that means that you would have to attack with him, deal the damage, and then you'd have double mana and be able to start doing things in second main, which may or may not bother you depending on what you're doing. But if you have haste enablers, you want your creatures out in first main so that you can attack with them. If you have any other, you know, just things that you can do that might benefit you going into combat, you would care about being able to do those things before going to combat. So having to regain the Monarch and then have to cast it, then have to wait till second main to have the double mana to cast things can be a big downside, and it has negatively affected me on one occasion. So that's why I'm more conscious of it, and I recognize that potential downside more. So in a lot of cases it won't affect you, but it is a downside that is problematic or can be problematic. And so that's one reason why I don't like it nearly as much. Then the final card in this video will be Overlaid Terrain. It's 4 mana, including double green. It's an enchantment. As it comes into play, sacrifice all lands you control. Lands you control have tap, add 2 mana of any one color to your mana pool. So this is one that I think is almost always strictly bad, except when it's not. If you are playing Corvold or Gitrog Monster, Titania, those things that want your lands to go to the graveyard, it's fine. I mean, this could come out in the mid to late game when you have 20 lands on the battlefield, and you just get whatever benefit from your lands going to the graveyard, and you don't even care about the mana doubling effect. Other times, maybe you get this out on turn 4 or 3 or 4, depending on what's going on, and you might be okay with it because if you have 2, 3, 4 lands in your hand, because you know you'll be able to rebuild at a decent pace. Especially if you get this out on turn 2, say you get a turn 1 Soul Ring, turn 2 you play a land, you get this out, and then turn 3 you have a forest that'll tap for 2 mana and your Soul Ring, it's not so bad. I think, though, that this would, aside from the previous commanders that I mentioned, you'd want this in a deck where you can get your lands back. Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator. There's a couple cards in like Lord Windgrace that'll get you some lands out of your graveyard. He doesn't benefit from them going to the graveyard like the other ones do, but he does have a way to get them back. And then obviously there's at least one green card. I want to say Splendid Reclamation. I don't use it, so I don't really remember, but it gets you all lands from your graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. So if you had enough mana to where you could cast this, sacrifice all your lands, float the mana first, then play the other card, get them all back, and now they all tap for 2, you can get huge synergy there, especially if you're playing like a Gitrog, where you draw a bunch of cards from them going to the graveyard. Then you get them all back, and maybe you have an Avenger of Zendikar on the battlefield from the previous turn. Now you got 12 landfall triggers. All your plants are huge. You swing. you know, this could be part of a really amazing combo in a play like that, where you get whatever benefit from them going to the graveyard, and then like a landfall trigger from them all coming back when you get them back. But unless you're, so if you're building a deck that has a lot of ways to abuse that, then it's very good. But if you have no way of getting them back once they go to the graveyard, then best case scenario, you get this out on like turn 2 or 3. Well, 2 with like a Soul Ring if you happen to have that mana rock out. Maybe turn 4 if it's purely lands. And then turn 5 you have to start rebuilding. So, yeah, even in a best case scenario like that, it's not going to do you much good, at least not right away. So you do need to be in a deck that has a lot of synergies with it. So I think that more or less covers this video for the mana doublers. There were 15 of them that I covered. I didn't go over Doubling Cube because that one you have to pay 3 to activate it. And it doesn't actually add mana for each land or mana dork. So it works in a way that's a little bit different. Also worth mentioning is Mirage Mirror. It's not a mana doubler specifically, and it won't double your mana at all unless you already have one of these effects out. In my decks where I do include a lot of mana doublers, I do use both of those cards. Mirage Mirror, one thing that's worth pointing out, it doesn't do anything if you make it a copy of Gauntlet of Power or Cage Sun, because those you have to choose a color when they enter, so the Mirage Mirror won't have that, so it won't have the benefit. But if you had a Mirage Mirror become a copy of Mana Reflection, now all your permanents produce 4 times mana. Or Nyxbloom Ancient, it would produce 9 times mana. So those 2 I did not include in this video, but they are worth at least mentioning. Other than that, I do just want to go back to the very beginning and say that if you are trying to do big mana things, if you're trying to spend a lot of mana, do big things, draw a bunch of cards, just keep casting things. If it's not an infinite combo type deal, or you tutor for a specific thing and you're going really, really mana cheap, then I would strongly advise including 5 mana doublers in a deck in addition to 10 things that will fetch you lands, so that you can just ramp like crazy, play your card draw spells, play all the cards that you drew off of them, and do big things. So the value that these add to a deck can't be overstated. They are just amazing cards. With that, that's it for this episode, and thank you.